Today's topic-based Zoom is on effective dates and sequencing. We will be going over concepts and scenarios that will help you understand how effective dates and sequencing work. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our review and reinforcements page. If you have questions about the presentation, put them in the chat and we will get to them during the Q&A. Today's topics. First, we will go over effective dates and sequencing concepts. Next, scenarios, then resources and best practices, and end with Q&A. We will be going over the effective dates and sequencing concepts and then review how to view effective sequencing in workforce job summary, funding entry, and additional pay. Effective date, the date on which the associated information takes effect. The information is in effect until a new entry is made with a more current effective date. There are no stop dates on effective dated data. Caution, the effective date usually defaults to the system's current date, so update accordingly. Effective sequencing. The effective sequence indicated in what order the data was input or changes on a particular effective date. You can correct an existing effective dated row by stacking another row on top using the effective sequencing. When an effective sequence row is added, that row becomes the top stack and will be used as of that effective date instead of any previous rows with the same effective date. Considerations. On position, only one position data update can be submitted on a single effective date. Best practice is to use an effective date 1 month prior to the anticipated hire date to ensure ample effective dates for updates to the position prior to the hire date. If the hire date falls on the date of a salary scale change, then use the hire date as the position effective date. There is no effective sequencing on position. When an update is needed on an effective date that already exists on the position, UCPath Center will have to make the correction. Submit the position update form to Ask UCPath Center. For pay path, effective dates cannot be prior to hire date, after the expected job end date, or prior to conversion. Job data has effective sequencing, so the same effective date can be used for multiple actions. But because updates cascade forward, best practice is not to use effective dates too far in the future. Retroactive updates will cascade forward and enter an effective sequence row for every subsequent effective date. Only the change fields will move forward when using effective sequence. All other fields will remain the same. Funding. The effective date for funding entry is the date the funding source will be used for payroll processed on or after that date. Funding entry effective dates can be in the future. Once that future date becomes present, UCPath begins using the new funding source. Funding entry effective dates can be in the past, but a direct retro is necessary to move the payroll that has already hit the incorrect funding source. Funding entry has effective sequencing, so effective dates can be reused to fix incorrect funding. Retroactive updates will not cascade forward, so if needed, the funding will need to be updated on each subsequent effective date. Now let's take a look at how to review effective sequencing in Workforce Job Summary. The navigation to the Workforce Job Summary page is on the left. A new effective sequence row is created in job data when a new transaction is entered with the same effective date as an existing data row. The effective sequence field will begin at 0 and increase as additional rows of data are entered. Notice there are 3 effective sequence rows for effective date October 1st, 2021. Effective sequence 0 was the first update made on this effective date. Effective sequence 1 was the second update made on this effective date. Effective sequence 2 was a system-generated row triggered by an update to employees' job data. For more information about system-generated rows, you can refer to the job aid, job data, effective sequence, and impacts on the UCPath Transactor help site. Click on the Go to Job Data hyperlink to view when the effective sequence row was entered in the system. We'll go there together right now. Now we are on the job data page. The effective sequence field is found on the work location tab of the job data page below the effective date, and again at the top of each job data tab. The date created informs you when the update was made in the system. Notice the effective sequence 2 for effective date October 1st, 21 was created on October 13th. Let's click on the arrow to view the next page. Notice the effective sequence 1 for effective date 10/1/21 was created on October 5th. And let's click on the arrow to view the next page for effective sequence 0. And you can see that effective sequence 0 for effective date 10/1/21 was created on October 2nd. This was the first update made on this effective date. Now let's take a look at effective sequencing and funding entry. The navigation to the funding entry page is on the bottom left. Use effective sequencing to make an update to an existing effective dated row. Add a row with the same effective date and the system will generate a higher effective sequence for the new row. Notice UCPath generates a higher effective sequence number for the new row and the previous sequence becomes obsolete. Now let's take a look at effective dates and sequencing in additional pay. The plus buttons will allow you to enter additional sequences. Unlike effective sequencing in PayPath and funding entry, additional sequences do not override the data. It adds another additional pay. This functionality allows multiple additional pay data updates in a single transaction. When you enter an earnings code and an effective date that already has an additional pay, the current existing additional pay data will transfer over and the override data button will appear. If you are trying to update the end date, pay period amount, or goal amount for an existing additional pay, you will want to click the override data button. And for step-by-step instructions, you can refer to the Initiate Update to Additional PayPath Transaction UPK available on the UCPath Transactor help site. Now we will go over some scenarios: PayPath, funding entry, and additional pay. Scenario 1, PayPath. You need to update the pay rate for an employee effective September. There is already an effective dated row for September 1st, 2021 for a pay rate increase with the incorrect pay rate. Since this is a job data update, you know that you can use the effective date again in PayPath. Steps to take. First, review the PayPath action reason code job aid to determine the action reason codes that best fit your situation. There is no substitute for reviewing that PayPath action reason code job aid. After the update in after you have the action reason codes, enter the update and pay path with the effective date and the action reason codes that you chose in step 1. Step 3, enter comments, click save and submit. And finally, after your approver approves your transaction, review the workforce job summary page to make sure the update you intended was accomplished. If you notice that the update didn't stick, you may try submitting it through PayPath again, or you will need to submit a job data update form to UCPath Center. Scenario 2, funding entry. You need to update funding effective 7/1, and there are effective dated rows for 7/1, 9/1, and 12/1. You know that retroactive funding updates do not cascade forward, so you will need to enter an effective sequence row for each of the effective dates you want the new funding to take effect. Steps to take. First, on the funding entry page, click the View All to see all the effective dated rows. Once you have determined which effective dated rows you need to update to the new funding source, click the plus button on the right side of every effective dated row you want to enter a new effective sequence for. So, and then once you have updated all the effective dated rows you need, enter your comments and click save and submit. You will need to do a direct retro transaction for all payroll that has already hit the incorrect funding source. All right, scenario 3, additional pay. You need to enter a stipend for an employee on the same earn code, STP, 9/1 or September through December for $100 a month, and October for $50. You know there are a lot of issues with updating additional pay. The recommended steps are to enter 3 separate rows or additional sequences by clicking the plus button next to the effective date. Additional sequence 1, you will enter effective date 9/1, end date 9/30, pay period amount $100, goal amount $100. Additional sequence 2, effective date 10/1, end date 10/31, pay period amount $150, goal amount $150. Additional sequence 3, effective date November 1st, end date December 31st, pay period amount $100, and goal amount $200. But let's say you need to enter a stipend for an employee on earn code STP for $50 effective October, but there is already a reoccurring stipend STP effective September through December for $100 a month in the system. So, there are a lot of issues with updating additional pay, and today's October 15th. Steps to take: submit the STP for October through a one-time payment and make sure it is approved by the employee data change deadline to be added to the on-cycle paycheck. If you try updating the additional pay to add an additional sequence, you will notice that the existing additional pay will update and the goal balance will clear out. You can choose to update the goal amount by subtracting what was already paid out, and theoretically, the end date should stop it from issuing any payments after the end date, but you will still need to closely monitor to make sure there is an overpayment. It will be much cleaner just to submit a one-time payment for October. Resource review. You can search the UC San Diego job aids and quick references page on the UCPath or the UCPath help site for transactional users for instructions on how to do specific transactions. Particular ones to note are the quick reference guide using effective dates in UCPath, available on our UC San Diego job aids page, and the job aid, job data effective sequencing and impacts, available on the UCPath transactor help site. Best practices. Pay attention to effective dates. The effective date is the date the transaction will take place. Remember to pay attention to this date when doing retro and future dated transactions. I know we didn't go over template transactions, but I just wanted to add that mismatching effective dates and action reason codes are the #1 reasons for transfer processing delays. So please pay attention to effective dates. It's important everywhere. Next, enter effective date rows in chronological order. Because when inserting a row with an effective date that precedes an existing future dated row, the system adds an additional sequence to each row with the future effective date. Do not submit job data change transactions too far in advance. When retroactive transactions are added, many additional rows can be created for the employee and job data. There is no effective sequencing on position. If you need to use an effective date that has already been used for a position update, submit the position update form to UCPath Center. Funding entry updates have effective sequencing. Retroactive updates will not cascade forward, so if needed, the funding will need to be updated on each subsequent effective date. Also, retroactive funding updates require a direct retro to move the payroll that has already hit the incorrect funding source. And finally, additional pay is tricky. Additional sequence is not the same as effective sequence. To update an existing additional pay, use the override data button. And when making updates to additional pay, monitor the paycheck to make sure you see the intended results. Thank you all for joining us for the topic-based Zoom on effective dates and sequencing.